G'day guys, Year 12, I remember this time. Today we're going to continue on with social theories, but we're going to look at evolutionary theory. This is probably the easiest theory to understand, so it's the one that won't take long to explain and teach at all. So evolutionary theory was created by this guy called Charles Darwin. You might have heard of Darwinism, or the theory of evolution. He was the guy that came up with it. The theory that of the Homo sapien, or the Homo sapien, as we've put it here: Monkeus, Etelotus, Chimpus, Imbecillus, Apius stupidus, Neanderslob, and the Homo sapien. That's just there for a bit of fun. But the idea is, that humans started as apes, and then we evolved slowly to the Homo sapien, which is, the race of people that we are today. So the reason we are applying this theory to society is that it's used to explain a type of change, obviously called evolutionary theory. So the idea of evolutionary theory is that every society develops over time and that they all pass through the same linear processes of change that are ordered and step by step. So that's a really important thing to highlight. It goes through the same linear processes of change. According to evolutionary theory, all societies go from point A to point B. It's just a fact. An example of this is that societies used to all be hunter-gatherer societies, where you would hunt for your food, and then that changed to an agrarian society. So above agrarian, can you write farming? That's what an agrarian society is. So no longer did we hunt our food, we're nomads and moved from place to place. We settled down into one spot. We started to build farms and buildings and grow our own food, which removed the need to be hunting and gathering all the time. We then and all of these processes, were hundreds or thousands of years. So the idea that it's a long, slow change. Then we went to the industrial society, in which we saw the invention of machines, thinking those big boats from the colonization period. You've got people starting to invent, gunpowder and all those sorts of things. You then get into what was the post-industrial society. So these are all the factories and machines. Think kind of World War II, World War I era. About 150 years ago. And then what we have today, which is the modern society. We've got technology, internet, and all of this change. Well, the idea is that, according to evolutionary change, every country and place on Earth has gone through the same type of change from point A to point B. So people use it to explain structural change at that level, at evolutionary theory, but they've also used it to explain social and cultural forces as well, not just the physical forces we could see manifesting in the world, like humans changing from one species to another, or societies changing from one type to another. They've also used it to justify their world point of view. So for example, colonialism, imperialism, this idea that white men are better than all other types of ethnicities or cultures around the world, that the Western way of life is the best way of life, is evolutionary theory, because it's one that's grown steadily over time, and one that we've seen increase over time. People even use it to justify racism and bigotry, and I put an IMO in there because that's just my opinion. That's what these two seem like to me. So the idea that according to evolutionary theory, because that's the way it is, that's the way we were designed. Some people are smarter than others, some people are better off than others, some people deserve more things than other people, because that's how we've changed over time. It's in our DNA, it's how we've developed. That's the kind of thinking that people use to explain social and cultural forces. According to evolutionary theory, I would highlight this point, that the rate of social change is slow and gradual, and highlighting it is evolutionary change. Okay, so it's pretty obvious evolutionary change evolutionary theory, has evolutionary change as its type of change. Remembering there are two types of change that we look at in society, or three, but the two main ones are evolutionary change and transformative change. The other is structural change, and that structural change occurs as a result of evolutionary or transformative change. So remembering evolutionary change that takes a long time, transformative change is change that happens quickly and dramatically. Another thing with evolutionary theory is that all change is considered progress. So highlighting that, it's the idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest. So for example, modernization. So that's why they consider any change to be progressive, because we're replacing the old with the new and we're making it more efficient, quicker, smarter, stronger, better, faster, all that kind of stuff. Westernization is seen as a similar thing. You know, why else would every country around the world adopt westernization and Western values? Clearly they're the best. Clearly they're better, faster, stronger, smarter than all the others. And that's why it's so popular. That's the view evolutionary theory would take. I've put neo-evolutionism in here. Neo means new, so you could write that above there if you want. And it's kind of creating this new view of evolutionism in society, of that kind of natural selection that some people are supposedly better than others because of just who they are. And as we said, it explained imperialism and colonization as well. The criticisms. So that's the key features of evolutionary theory. If we look at our dot point here, that's the key features of evolutionary change. We're now going to quickly look at the three areas here. Now, I will note that not all theories need to hit those three. We've done it for conflict because that's our main one, but for some of them, you don't need to include the processes and agents of change. But here we go. So the criticisms of evolutionary theory. It assumes that all societies follow the same linear path, that, you know, everyone goes from A to B, as we see here. But we know for a fact that that's not true. Societies often follow very different paths to get to where they are. So that's a criticism of evolutionary theory. Another criticism is that it believes that industrial societies are superior to primitive societies. So in other words, that modern societies are better than traditional societies. So if we were to put that into another context, it's the idea that the modernized technological country is far better than the primitive country that has no electricity and access to things. So where you would argue that, for example, is that if you look at the amount of mental health issues that the supposed modern world has, the more superior people. We've got higher rates of depression, higher rates of suicide. In some cases, we don't live as long, or we might be living longer, but is it the quality of life necessarily there versus the traditional sort of way of living where suicide was lower? There was heaps less cases of mental health issues. We didn't live in Western countries where most of the population is considered unhealthy in either their weight or there's things like drug addiction, alcohol addiction. So all of these elements of negative things that didn't exist in the traditional world. So the criticism is that just because something is perceived as more primitive or it's not as technically advanced doesn't necessarily mean that it's superior. Okay, so it depends on how you measure that progress, right? So they view that all that progress is considered, all change, is considered progress, but the criticism here is, well, no, not all change is progress. Sometimes you can take one step forward and two steps back. Another criticism is that it adopts an ethnocentric view of the world. So ethnocentric, if you want to write above here, is the belief that one ethnicity is superior to all the others. So the idea that the white man's burden, which was the cultural imperialism of the West, the idea that the white man has to educate everyone on the grand way of living and the best way of living, is a criticism there, because yes, there are many good things about how they live, but it's not necessarily the best for everyone, and it's not necessarily the best overall, if there is such a thing. The other criticism is that it has a narrow viewpoint. It doesn't consider things like globalization or what we call cultural diffusion. So cultural diffusion is how when you interact different cultures, you might see a way that they do something better than you, and you integrate and adopt that practice into your own culture. And so obviously when we see a lot of these changes happening over time, a lot of so for example, an example of cultural diffusion is how our firefighters use the Indigenous Australian method of backburning. Okay, they don't do it as well, obviously, but the same principles apply there. So evolutionary theory doesn't acknowledge that. They just acknowledge that as men getting progressively better, and not necessarily acknowledging that idea came from the so-called primitive society, not the modern society. So it's got a narrow viewpoint. And leading on from that, it doesn't acknowledge the intricacies and complexities of change. So that's another flaw with evolutionary theory. It thinks from A to B, everything's kind of black and white thinking, whereas we know there are a lot of shades of grey in between. So with the structural changes of evolutionary theory, the idea is that societies develop from simple, small-scale beginnings into more complex modern societies as they go. As we can see in this image here, we start with the candle to the light bulb, to energy efficient light bulbs, to whatever this futuristic looking light bulb is. So the idea is that any structural change within society starts small and then ends up big over time. Again, the structural change takes a long time to complete, so you go from primitive to complex over centuries and over hundreds and thousands of years. The idea, according to the theory, is that social structures also become more complex over time, which is true. And then the other structural change within society or belief is that any technological development is the main agent of social change. So that technology is driving most of the evolutionary change we see today. So when we look at the directions of change, we know it's linear. Linear meaning it goes from point A to B. It's a very clear path. And that it also means that any change is cumulative, sorry, I always get that one wrong, developmental and usually permanent. So the direction of change in a nutshell is evolutionary change, quite literally, as the name suggests. And that's it for that one. See you in the next one.